Let's begin by reading the sixth duty of the laity. With the help of God's grace, it shall be the duty of every member of the church to give regular financial support to the church, with the biblical tithe as the minimum standard of giving. Despite what it may seem from all the televangelists we may hear in society today, most pastors I know don't really like talking about giving. And this is partially because there have been so many hucksters who have preached in the name of Christ. A few years ago, just before preaching a sermon on giving, I remember talking to my mother, and it came up that I was about to preach this sermon, and she sensed some hesitancy in me as I was going into the sermon. And I remember her sitting across from me and looking at me and saying, "TJ, you preach about tithing and don't you apologize for it." Her point was that tithing and giving should be normative to the Christian life. It should be a part of what we do. And because it is tied to the health and well-being of God's people, a pastor should not be ashamed to preach on it. Matter of fact, he should. It's part of his job to do so. And I think this is true. And so I obeyed my mother then, and I'm doing it again here today. And we're going to take a few minutes and talk about giving and tithing. I want to begin doing so by mentioning a couple of things that tithing is not. First, tithing is not just a way that we keep the lights on in the church. It's not simply a functional thing. Of course, it does allow us to do the business of the church in the world. It keeps the lights on, but that is not its primary function. Secondly, tithing is not charity. Now, once again, some of the money that is given in tithes does go to charitable acts. But sometimes I think we view tithing as an act of charity towards God, as if, well, God's in need and I'm going to do him a solid by giving him some money. God's not in need. He says this multiple times in the Old Testament that, do you think I need your sacrifices? I'm the one who created and made all things. All things belong to me. I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. I don't need your sacrifices. You're not doing an act of charity towards me when you give. So tithing is neither simply functional nor charity towards God. So what is it then? Well, it's many things, and we don't have necessarily time to cover them all, but let me list a few things that it is. Tithing is a practice that orients us properly towards God and towards our possessions. There are certain qualities that God expects of His people. And it's an interesting fact that in many of these qualities that God expects, He gives us ways to exercise and to train and build up those qualities. For example, God expects His people to be temperate and exercise self-control. And He gives us the practice of fasting to exercise that quality. He expects His people to rest in Him, to lay aside our cares and our anxieties and rest in Him. He gives us the practice of Sabbath rest to exercise this. God expects His people to be generous and to honor Him with our possessions. And He gives us the practice of tithing as a way of practicing and exercising that quality. I just mentioned tithing and Sabbath there together. And indeed, tithing and Sabbath are often linked together. And some will teach that both of these are just part of the Mosaic law that has been set aside when Christ came. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But I'll say now that it seems to me that the practice and principle of tithing and Sabbath law are not part simply of the Mosaic law. They are baked into creation itself and then are highlighted in God's covenant with His people. The first example of tithing in Scripture, explicitly tithing in Scripture, predates the Mosaic law. You may remember the story of Abraham, who went out to rescue his nephew Lot, who had been captured by an army. Abraham goes and defeats the army, takes the spoils, and rescues Lot and his family. And as he's returning, he meets a man named Melchizedek, who is pictured as both the king of righteousness and peace, and also a priest. And Abraham gives a tithe to Melchizedek. The writer to the Hebrews in the New Testament relates Melchizedek to Christ who is both king and priest. And the writer says that all Israel paid tithes to Melchizedek in Abraham, and that in tithing to Melchizedek, they were indeed honoring Christ. And this ultimately is what tithing is. When we first find in Genesis, and we find it later in Hebrews, we find that tithing is an act of honoring the king and an act of worship. It's not just, as I said, it's not just a function, it's not just a practical thing to keep the lights on. Tithing is an act of worship. And it is an act of returning to God that which we have given. This is why it's so central liturgically to our worship on Sunday. We find it right in the middle of our service is the presenting of tithes and offerings. And this is, once again, not just a functional thing. This is a central act of worship for God's people. As we are bringing the tithes forward, we sing the doxology, and while the people sing it, I will take the basket of money and I will hold it up and I will say, "All things come from you, O Lord, and of thine own have we given you." We are returning to God what is already His in an act of worship. He has given to us. We are returning to Him. And this principle is indeed highlighted in the Old Testament law. God says to His people, "I'm leading you into a new land, and there, if you obey me, you will be fruitful. It'll be a fruitful land. I'm giving you this land, and you in turn will give a portion back to me in a tithe." Now, speaking of the Mosaic Law, to say a tithe may be a bit misleading. Many scholars see 3 different tithes that the people were expected to pay. Therefore, leading up to 30%. If there has been confusion when I've referred to a tithe, I'm talking about 10% of our income, that which we earn, we return to the Lord. And so it seems many scholars think that the people in the land were expected to give actually 3 tithes, 30% of their income they were to return to the Lord. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are those who would argue that the tithe is an Old Testament thing. It's set aside in the New Testament. It's never explicitly commanded in the New Testament. Yet, if the tithe were set aside in the New Testament, it would not be set aside in favor of giving less. Rather, if it's set aside, it would be set aside towards giving more. In fact, giving everything. There is no hint that the New Testament expectation for God's people is now that we have received the great example of Christ giving Himself to us and for us, His great sacrifice on our behalf, having received this, that now we should be expected to give less of ourselves and of our possession. No, the push in the New Testament is, if it's setting aside a tithe, is to say, guys, you're giving everything. You're holding nothing back. So a tithe, then, the church has thought through its time that a tithe is a good and right and biblical starting point for giving. This is where we began, the biblical minimum, as our duties say. Now, there are a couple of questions raised at this point by talking about a tithe. So some would ask, is this talking about a 10% of net income or gross income? And is this to be given to the church or just simply given to good causes out into the world? And here I don't have chapter and verse to give you that answers this question. And I know godly people who disagree on this. But I will say that my reading of the New Testament and the general reading that I find, once again, in these duties of the laity, is that the push is towards giving more, not less. And that tithing is an act of worship. And the primary place of worship is the church. So if I'm going to worship God with my possessions, that first goes to the place of worship that God has given us, the church. Because of this, for myself, Shuey and I, we have committed to giving a minimum of 10% of our gross income to the church. And beyond that, to give offerings and support to various ministries and missionaries that are outside St. Andrews itself. Now, there's a couple reasons I give my own example in this, and it's not as a brag. First, I give my own example here because a stated part of my job is to lead by word and example, and in this case, I don't know how else to do that by simply stating what I believe to be true and what I am doing. And to note, there are no clergy discounts when it comes to tithing. And the second reason why I'm comfortable sharing this is because, as I stated at the beginning, tithing is to be normative in the Christian faith and amongst God's people, and so it's not necessarily a thing to be hidden. Now, I'm not saying we compare our checks and we go around telling everybody what we're giving, sounding trumpets as we give. But again, it should be a normative point, not something that should be assumed, I think, that we are tithing. Now, let me note here, when it comes to sort of that idea of comparing checks, I actually, even as rector of St. Andrews, I don't know who gives and who doesn't. I do not receive a list of givers and how much they give. That is information that I don't know and I don't look at. So it is not as if I know who the givers are and therefore give them special treatment or anything like that. I don't know. But I do assume that if our intent is to worship God, and part of that is to worship God with our possessions, that it will be normative for us to return to Him a portion of the possessions that He has given to us as an act of worship. Now, that's not easy. And God gives us commandments to do things that are hard. And this is particularly hard if this is a practice that you have not previously done. It's not you engaged in, not something you have done before. To go from giving a little or occasionally to giving a tithe as the starting point for your giving may be prohibitive for many people. And so if this is the case, what I would encourage you to do is to begin giving as you can and work towards, make a plan to work towards tithing regularly, to giving that 10% of your income to the church. I would also encourage parents to instill this in their children very young. And I'm very grateful to my parents for having done this. As a young boy, it was taught to me that when you get money, when you earn money, you don't think about it. The first thing you do is return a portion of that, a tithe of that to God. That's just what happens. And because it was instilled in me very young, it has not been a difficult practice in many times throughout my life. Even when I wasn't making hardly any money, it was just the discipline and practice that I knew to do. And so I would do it. And so I think it really is helpful for parents to begin to instill this in their children from a young age. What we do with our possessions, as is often stated, really shows both to us and I think to the world what we treasure, what we prize, what we put our faith and trust in. Am I trusting God to take care of me, or am I trusting in my money to take care of me? Where does my trust and faith lie? And as an act of worship, as an act of letting God know that He indeed is where our trust lies. I think it is a good and right practice for us to tithe as an act of worship, and then to give generously as He has enabled us to do. And I think we will find God faithful in His provision for us, His taking care of us. Does it mean we will become wealthy? I'm not teaching a prosperity gospel here, that if you give your tithe, God is going to make you rich. I don't think necessarily that is true. He's not going to give you an abundance of worldly possessions, of money and riches because you tithe. But I do think He'll take care of us. And what we are doing when we give is to say, I trust you and I worship you. You have given me your very self. You have given me all good things that I have. You have given me the joy and blessing of being in a relationship with you. You have blessed me richly, and I, in turn, will return a portion of my riches to you in an act of worship. This is a good thing. It is the right thing. It is a beautiful thing. And I say, in obedience to God, and I think my mother, that it is a thing that we should all do.